Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of Runetalker. I'm Maitland Cameron, joined by Simon.
Hi, everyone.
And we're here very close to the season, or closer than I thought it was a few days ago. So I've lost a week or two of testing time that I thought I had, but that's all good. So we're going to, this episode, talk about the top 13 decks or so that we think are, that we're considering putting our lineups, that we think a lot of people will be there, and we think that it's worth having a chat about and understanding when you're thinking about what you want to put in your lineup and also what you want to be playing on ladder.
Yeah, exactly right. So 13, nice even number. There are so many decks which are viable, and especially in a tournament format like this, you might have to stretch out and play some decks you otherwise might not consider, just to make sure you're meeting all the requirements.
Yeah, I do think after these decks that we're talking about, it is a lot of decks. I think it does drop off quite quickly. Like these are basically all the decks that I think are good, and then there's not that I think are good. I think there's other good decks, but these are the ones that are good and have actual data behind them that we can look at and analyze. These are basically the top 13 decks that are played on Masters in the mobalytics data. So it's a sample size of the full Masters bracket, but it does give you a really good indication of what people are playing and how the matchups are between the different lineups. For those that are hoping to qualify for the seasonal, why don't we have a bit of a chat about where we think a safe cutoff point is? I want to preface this by saying that we have no idea, and if you take what we say now to heart and end up missing out, then we're very sorry. But we've got no clue. At the moment, I'm sitting on 159 LP, and I think you said you're on about 153?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep, so I've got a nice buffer on you, which is useful, and I'm sitting at 340th on the ladder. We're remembering that the top 700 qualify, and you'll be just a bit under that, I guess. I'm not sure exactly, around 350, 360. And where did you say that the cutoff currently is for top 700?
Yeah, so right now we're about 26 hours out from cutoff, and top 700 is 120 LP. So it's a much higher cutoff already than it was this time last season.
Yeah, and I imagine there's more Masters players, more interest, it seems, which is great for the game. Bad for those of people that had thought they might be at a safe threshold and might need to do a bit more grinding. I'd say that, if you're in the 120 region and thought you were safe, I don't think it's going to be safe. I think the cutoff is going to end up being between around 130 and 140. I do think that we'll still be safe. Like at 340th at the moment, that means 360 people have to jump over me, and a lot of the people that are in that sort of region to jump over me would be sitting as well, so it's an even greater number that needs to jump over all of us. How are you feeling sitting at 153?
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that I'm going to hold and be a lock for the tournament. So I'm not planning on playing any additional games. I will keep an eye on it tomorrow. And, if it's looking like a lot of extra LP is coming into the system, more than I might expect, then I might need to play some games. If you do decide that you need to play some games, if you've been sitting on your LP and suddenly you decide, okay, I need to play, otherwise I might not be in, the sooner you make that decision, the better. And the reason is, if you queue up, with 20 minutes to go, you've got one game left, it's do or die. If you win, you're in. And if you lose, you're out. Well, if you just made that play, let's say 2-3 hours earlier, if you lose that first game, you still have enough time to, play some more games and get up to a safe position. So the sooner you can figure that out and make that choice, the better.
Yeah, totally agree. You want to be watching, as we were last season, watching and see how the cutoff is changing. If it's moving slowly, then I don't think it'll ever really have a sudden increase in the speed at which it moves. I think it's going to be a pretty steady move. So if you see it getting closer to where you're sitting, like Simon said earlier, that you can make that decision because you need to win more games than you lose in your last patch. The quicker that you can do that, you give yourself more time to have that positive win record that you need to get slightly higher than you currently are.
Yeah, definitely. And one other interesting consideration that I hadn't really thought about that was mentioned in the Discord was that even if you don't finish in the top 700, not all Masters players are going to show up on the day of the tournament. So if you go, there's a little queue, and you can join the queue, and if some Masters players don't show up and you're the next ranked player, you will still be able to play in the tournament. So keep that in mind. A lot of people have Smurfs in the top 700, and there are obviously some Riot employees in the top 700, and they can't play the tournament either. So it's pretty unpredictable, and I would much rather be in a position where, I'm just locked for the tournament. I know I'm going to play the tournament, especially because here in Australia, the tournament starts at, 7 or 8 a.m. on a Monday. So I need to take time off work, and I don't want to, be making that sort of a gamble. But definitely an option and something to keep in mind when you're deciding what the best thing for you is.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that there is a bit of a buffer there. So if you think you're going to be right on the threshold, it might be safer, especially if you're getting really close to the cutoff, it might be safer just to sit and trust in the fact that there'll be enough people that drop out that you're able to sneak in there. All right,
yeah.
With all that quite boring ladder talk done, let's get stuck into the interesting stuff. Let's get stuck in talking about the decks. And so one of the ones that I feel like every single day we have this conversation where you think that Spooky Anivia is a fringe, unplayed deck, and I remind you that it is one of, if not at times, the most played deck in Masters, and that definitely it will be present at the seasonal in some fashion, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people bring it, because it's a strong deck. It has a lot of really good matchups, and I think it's a really good deck to build a lineup around. Like, for a long time, for the last season when I was preparing for that, Spooky Anivia and FTR, because you can't have both of those decks because they're the same color combinations. They were what I was sort of looking to base my lineup around, building a triple SI lineup to beat all of the aggressive burn and pirate and mid-range sort of focused decks with all the life gain that you have and removal that you have. So yeah, Spooky Anivia, with the addition of Gluttony as well as some of the other shifts in the meta, has just risen to be quite a powerful deck. What are your thoughts on including this in a lineup?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a pretty strong choice. I am definitely guilty of forgetting that it exists and it is a key player. I think that's partly because we haven't been testing it maybe quite as much as we should.
I've played this deck so much.
Well, all right, share that knowledge, Maitland. Share that knowledge. Yeah, I think it's definitely a strong player. I think people are starting to adapt to it. One thing that I think people believe about Anivia is that it's a heavy favourite against TF Fizz, but I think it's actually surprisingly even from the data that I've seen, and particularly if the Fizz decks are running suit up, they can, have a real shot in that matchup, because if you can suit up a Fizz, it's really, really hard for the Anivia deck to deal with that outside of something like a Ruination.
Oh no, you're totally right. That's a really good point. I also was, when you're looking at mobalytics data, or any data really, this is really relevant for data analysis, which is a burgeoning, a huge field in a lot of industries, and it's really important for people, particularly if you're not particularly, but if you're trying to be good and competitive in card games. Analyzing data is really important, and one of the things that you got to be careful at with mobalytics data, which I fall for all the time, is there's the way that they classify decks. I'm not 100% sure how it works, but there must be a certain overlap of cards that constitute a deck. And so let's say that if the threshold is 4 cards off, and you're running a TF Fizz list that is 4 cards off another list, and I'm not saying that's the threshold, but there is some sort of a threshold, then those data, that'll be different data sets for when you're looking at matchups. And so something that happens, and you can see it if you look at the Anivia data, is that if you have a look, you can see that TF Fizz is a good matchup. 67% for Anivia. That's really good. But the sample size is only 52 games. And then if you scroll down and look at the bad matchups, TF Fizz is a 46.2% matchup with 468 games, which is a much larger sample size. And there's another couple of erroneous ones floating about, but that's the biggest sample size we have. And so there'll be certain things. It's hard to look at the specific deck lists. I don't think it always works. I can't always pull it out, but I would imagine that things like you said, like suit up, really affect those matchups. And so you want to be really careful when you are looking at this sort of data and trying to pick your lineup, that you're not getting tricked into thinking a matchup is considerably better than it is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's just another important point as well, is, have a plan for each matchup as well. So if that's a pretty big swing in win rate percentage. Obviously, it's small sample size, so one of them might not be, necessarily accurate, but if changing a few cards in your list can shift a matchup that much, and you know exactly what you're trying to do in a specific matchup, that's going to help you a lot, and that's going to be a really good, place to put your effort when you're practicing.
Yeah, and data's really, really important and really good, but it's also important that you test those assumptions, and we'll talk about this a bit later on when we get into Freljord Overwhelm, but that was one that on paper just looks amazing, and I was really happy to include in my lineup. And then after playing a few games with it, I just wasn't able to feel as confident in certain matchups as I wanted to. And obviously, I only played a few games, I don't have the right sample size, but it's important to understand as well how the matches feel and how you feel like they're playing out and how you feel in the games. And from that, there's been matchups I've tested where I've gone 0-5, but I still feel really good about it. And there's been matchups I've tested where I've won a bunch and I've been like, no, this matchup's not representative. And so it's important to sort of build that intuition, I guess. And if we want to talk a bit more about Anivia specifically, because we've sort of gone off to a bunch of different concepts, the sort of things that I'd be looking to target if I was including Anivia in my lineup, I mean, the biggest one for me is burn. If you want to beat the Teemo, the Draven, the Jinx, those sort of discard aggro-centric burn decks, then Anivia is basically the best port of call you can have, because it just dumpsters those matchups. And similarly, it's also very strong in the slower burn decks, the Draven decks. You're not ever going to see a lineup that has both of those, so that's important to understand that that's not, even though those are two really popular decks, that's not two ticks in the Anivia bucket necessarily, because you're never going to get a lineup where someone's able to have two Draven decks. And so even though they're going to be a big part of the meta, you're not going to be able to just destroy lineups with it.
Yeah, definitely. Keeping that in mind is really important when you're building your lineup, because you might be like, okay, I can build a deck that just, destroys all of these Aphelios decks, but, your opponent's only going to have one Aphelios deck. And that can be a viable strategy. That can be a good strategy, but just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I do think looking at generally, and again, it's tough with this data because there's so many TF decks, there's so many Aphelios decks, so they are all over the place. I would say that in general, Anivia's real strengths are the Draven decks, basically all of those, the TF decks, except for the TF Fizz deck, which we think is a bit negative, and the Aphelios decks in general as well. I think that it's pretty good there, although I would imagine that some of the late game focused, more Invoke focused Aphelios lists might be difficult for Anivia, but most of them are skewing more mid range, and Anivia eats all that sort of stuff up.
Yeah, definitely.
But the weaknesses that you want to be aware of with this deck, Targon Kench is a massive one. It's really hard for Anivia to beat the Targon Kench decks. The Teemo, the Teemo Ezreal decks, which are starting to pick up a lot in popularity, are bad matchups as well. You sort of get milled out. Deep is apparently not a good matchup, which we're all very, very big proponents of. Freljord Overwhelm, which is a bit of a fringe deck, but I think one that a lot of people would be considering because it's got a lot of really good matchups, isn't good. And so there are some of the things, and the TF Fizz as well, which is, for me, when I'm looking at lineups, TF Fizz is sort of the first defining pillar of the meta for me, I think. TF Fizz and Fiora Shannon are the two biggest decks, I think, that are tough to beat. They're really well known. A lot of people are going to have them in their lineups, and so either playing them or having a plan for them is really sort of what I'm centralizing all of my thinking about the seasonal around.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. But just from play experience as well, on paper it might feel like Anivia can just absolutely crush the TF Fizz deck, but having played it, it just doesn't, feel like a huge favorite. So if that's the main reason you're playing Anivia, maybe jam some more games and see if you still feel that way after testing it.
Yeah, and it's important to try against some different lists as well, particularly for these new TF and Aphelios decks. There's a lot of different builds, and a few cards can really swing matchups. For example, Zornite Urchin is one that I found last night against decks that aren't able to kill TF. Zornite Urchin just lets you flip TF more consistently and faster and can swing those matchups. And like you said before, Suit Up is a big one that can have a lot of impacts in a lot of matchups, particularly things like Anivia that are trying to ping down your little creatures. It can get you a lot of value there.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. I think that's basically everything I want to say about Anivia. It's a really big deck. It's got a lot of matchups on either side that are really strong, really weak. I don't think it's one at this stage that I'm looking to include in my lineup, and a big part of that is at the moment, and maybe I end up on the decision that I'm just going to ban Teemo Fizz. Fizz TF. Maybe that's the decision I make. But at the moment, I'm really looking to try and have good matchups against Fizz TF if that's possible, and so I don't really want to run Spooky Anivia for that reason. But it might just end up that having 3 decks that can beat Fizz TF is just not possible, and so then I'll put Anivia back on the list.
Yeah, I'm considering Anivia for my lineup as well, but yeah, we'll just have to see how we go. Put a few decks together, see how the lineup looks overall, but it's definitely one that I am considering.
Well, why don't we move on to the elephant in the room, Fizz TF, because that is it's such a polarizing force in the meta and is very difficult to beat. So I think it's time we move on to it. And what I've found in testing and playing the deck is, apart from the fact that it just feels incredibly strong and consistent, is that the ability to kill TF is something that a lot of decks don't have at the moment. And if your deck is not able to beat TF, to kill TF, then you've got a real clock on how quickly you have to win the game, because this deck is very consistent with flipping TF on turn 5, really, and winning after TF flips is just incredibly difficult for almost all decks. And so it puts a real constraint on the removal that you want to run in decks and also the decks that you're able to run.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a real force in the metagame at the moment. I think it's a really powerful deck. It's got a lot of different tools. It's got the beatdown game plan. It's got the value TF plan. Sometimes Ballistic Bot can get out of control. And like you mentioned, if a deck doesn't have answers to TF, it can be in trouble a lot of the time. But I think Fizz TF is the TF deck that can most easily kill an opposing Twisted Fate. You've got Mystic Shots, you've got your own Twisted Fate sometimes, you have Get Excited. You end up with a fair few options to get it off the board.
Yeah. And which also is just another big strength of the deck, is that spot removal, which again, not a lot of decks are utilizing at the moment. The meta sort of shifted a bit away from that, particularly with Lee Sin and in that sort of meta game, and it's going to have to shift again because it's going to need to adapt to Twisted Fate. And so if we're looking at the bad matchups for TF, let's start there. One of the ones that we see crop up the most is the different Aphelios TF decks. They are really good against it. I think a big part of that is being able to crescendum for Boxtopus, which gives you a really reliable way to kill Twisted Fate. I think that's really strong in the matchup, in a lot of other matchups, and also just you're playing TF, so you're able to gold card their TF potentially. The Fizz deck isn't often going to have a creature bigger than Twisted Fate when they play TF, so that's another option you have. And you're also you're pressuring them on a sort of similar timeline. I think that deck's faster than you, but you're able to interact and pressure them in similar ways. So that's a really positive matchup and a really negative matchup for TF Fizz, but it's not incredibly useful from a lineup perspective because you can't have 2 Twisted Fate decks, so they cancel each other out.
Yeah, definitely.
Another one that we've looked at the data at for a lot is that Freljord Overwhelm is really good, is really positive into Twisted Fate TF, but that's one that I haven't been able to figure out yet. We played a bit last night, and you don't run many answers to TF, and maybe I wasn't mulliganing hard enough to those answers. Maybe you just really need to hit those answers, and then that's why the matchup's good, but it just felt like I wasn't able to kill TF, and they killed me before I was able to get that kill in with the Overwhelm list. And so I was really high on the Overwhelm list. I think it's got really good stats, but I wasn't able to get this matchup to work, and so that sort of turned me off the deck a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's the right way to use data as well. So using the data to figure out, on paper it seems like, something might be going on here. This might be a really good matchup. Let's test it out, see if we can replicate that, and then, if we can't, maybe move on from the list.
So another deck that we've been looking at a lot is the Pirate Aggro deck. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to play Pirate Aggro in in any matchups yet. I've been including it. We've been doing some scrimming, and I've been including it in a lot of my lineups, but it keeps getting banned, so I haven't actually played any games with this yet to see how it feels into the TF decks.
Yeah, so I've played with the pirate list a little bit. It feels pretty strong. I think I like it more than something like discard aggro if I wanted to run an aggressive deck. I just think it's got a good sort of amount of top end. It's got enough early pressure, and some of the recent changes to the list. So the only 3 cost or less spell is Noxian Fervor. So every time that you play a Zap Sprayfin, you're guaranteed Noxian Fervor. That gives you some options. So for instance, against the Aphelios lists, one of the main ways that they're going to stabilize against the aggro decks is by getting a Severum to give a unit lifelink, and having the ability to Noxian Fervor your unit away can just help you close out a lot of those games.
Yeah, no, I think that is a really powerful tool. So that's one I'd like to get a bit more of a feel of. We'll talk more about Pirate Aggro later, but it's currently we're viewing it as a good matchup against the Fizz decks, and then the other good matchups against the Fizz decks are not really much to write home about. There's Go Hard, which I'm a bit iffy on how good that deck is still. Then there's the Mono Fiora deck, which is not really a big meta player, and so your options for targeting this deck, at least from decks that are being played a lot at Masters and have the data, are not very wide. And so if we look at what the good matchups, like the reasons you want to be playing TF is, obviously there's a lot of good matchups. You're really strong into Targon Lee, you're really strong into Lee Sin, you're really strong into a lot of the other Aphelios decks, all the Aphelios Zoe, those sort of more invoke lists. You're really strong into those. You're really strong into the Teemo Ezreal decks, which are getting really popular. And you're pretty even against Fiora Shen, which is a matchup that, like, being even isn't too exciting, but being even against Fiora Shen is pretty good because there's not many weaknesses to that deck. So if you're at least in a spot where you don't necessarily have to ban it, that's quite positive as well.
Definitely. There are a lot of strengths to the list.
Yeah, it also just really, if you're the sort of person that likes decks that reward gameplay and give you a lot of options, then you'll go well with this deck because you never stop making decisions, and it's a nightmare. And I can guarantee that every game that you lose, you can go back and try and recreate the decision trees, and there'll be 100 decisions that you made that influence the outcome of the game that you probably could have made better. So it's a great one for improving as well.
Definitely.
All right, let's move on to our favorite deck to talk about. Of course, it's Fiora Shannon, and like I alluded to before, this is another absolute pillar of the format. It's one of the most played decks in Master. It's been one of the most played decks for however many different metas now. Really popular, really strong, really difficult to combat effectively, particularly now that one of the deck's big weaknesses in the Targon Kench Raka deck has actually become much more even. So it's around 50% now, due, I imagine, to the nerfs in Hush, which is one of this deck's hardest cards to beat, and also Pale Cascade, and so that's taken one of those threats off the table. And then another really big weakness to this deck, the Ashe deck, is just not super popular at the moment. We'll talk about that a bit later, but there's not too much Ashe around because of other weaknesses, and so it's a really good time to be playing Fiora Shen, as it basically always is.
Yeah, honestly, I'm so biased when it comes to Fiora Shen that I do need an objective third party to let me know that it is actually good, but Mobalytics is doing that for me here, and confirming Fiora Shen, still a great deck. I think it's a great tournament deck as well. Yeah. Fiora doesn't really go in that many lists, and Shen essentially only goes in this deck, and the faction combination isn't too popular either. So it's a really easy one to slot into a lineup, and at the moment, it doesn't really have that many weaknesses.
Yep, so I would not be at all surprised if we end up playing Fiora Shen in the seasonal. I don't think anyone listening would probably be surprised either. Some of the weaknesses that the deck does have is, and we haven't, I don't think I've tested some of these matchups, but the Aphelios TF deck is a bit of a weakness. And that's one of the strongest decks. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That is not necessarily going to be a huge player because TF and Aphelios are both really powerful cards, and they're both found in a lot of different lists. And so if you play the TF Aphelios deck, then that means that you're not running TF Fizz, and you're not running any of the myriad of other Aphelios options. So it is a big constraint in your lineup if you want to include that in your lineup, and also you still give your opponent the option of banning out that deck. So even though that deck has a lot of really good matchups, your opponents can just ban it. And so unless your other two decks have similar matchup spreads, you might be ending up in a position where that's just banned every round, and you end up with your other two decks sort of falling apart.
Yeah, it's definitely a risk.
So some of the other matchups, the Zoe decks are all pretty good matchups, although I'm seeing a lot of data for these Zoe decks. I haven't seen many Zoe decks on the ladder, so I'm not sure exactly how present those are. The Lee Sin matchup has gotten a lot better since the nerf of Hush. It's quite good now. The Anivia matchup, I think, is slightly positive, but it's pretty close to 50%. And to be honest, most of your matchups are pretty close to 50%, and you just really want to be leveraging your understanding of the deck and your play skill to be able to get over the line.
Definitely. The Anivia matchup is an interesting one because some amount of the time you're supposed to go for a Fiora win, whereas, that can be quite risky against a deck that has Vengeance and the Ruination, but some games that's your main path to victory, so just being aware of that is helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really important in a lot of matchups, particularly in the discard aggro. I find it's really important, but the Anivia one is the matchup where I find it's the most important to get it right. If you get the decision wrong on whether or not you're going to go for Anivia for a Fiora win, and that's correct, it's really punishing because you really have to go all in. And like you said, if they are able to get through your defenses and kill the Fiora, then you're just dead. And if you don't go for the Fiora win in a game where you really needed to, then you'll end up just getting overrun by all the Anivias. So it's really that's a really good matchup to test so that you're able to make that decision when the time comes.
Agreed.
Is there anything else we wanted to say about Fiora Shen? I don't really want to necessarily move off it. The Draven decks are still bad matchups, but again, the fact that the bigger Draven decks, the Ezreal Draven decks are bad, and the discard aggro, you're not going to see both of those in a lineup. So them overlapping is quite good for you because you can just ban their Draven deck, and you won't have two big weaknesses. And then, the TF Aphelios is the other big one to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like TF Aphelios is probably the deck that you might most want to ban with Fiora Shen, or at least the deck that's most likely to show up, which is a bad sort of matchup. So keep that in mind when picking the decks for the rest of your lineup as well. And just another reminder as well that Fiora Shen just has so many flex slots, and there are a lot of pieces you can change matchups. So this is definitely a deck that if you predict the metagame well and you tune your Fiora Shen deck well, then you are probably going to get a pretty nice reward from that.
Yeah, I don't think we've got time to really go into it now, but what would you suggest to someone that wanted to understand more about the flex slots in Fiora Shen and what they are and which matchups you should be considering them in? What sort of resource could someone go to learn more about that?
So in a previous episode of the podcast, I think it might have been episode 7, we actually talked a lot about Fiora Shen. We talked about a lot of its different matchups, how to mulligan, what all the flex slots are. So I would recommend going back and checking that episode out if you're interested in that.
Yeah, just brilliant, always relevant content. So be sure to check that one out. Let's move on to Targon Lee. So this was one of the, I think it was the most played deck for a couple of patches, and then got hit with some nerfs in the Aphelios patch, and so it's still a very big part of the meta, but it's not quite as, it was quite impressive. It really needed some nerfs, so that was good to see those, but it's still definitely a good one to consider for the seasonal. It's got some really good positive matchups. It's pretty good into the Aphelios Zoe list again. Is really good into Ezreal Draven, which is a really popular deck that has a lot of really good matchups. So being positive there is really strong. It's also good against the Freljord Overwhelm deck, which a lot of people might be looking to try and target some of the popular decks. And The big strike for me is that I just think Deny has just really fallen off. With the release of Aphelios, the rise of Twisted Fate, there's just not a lot to deny at the moment, and so which we didn't bring up as a weakness for Fiora Shannon, that might be a bit biased, but that and a very big weakness to the Twisted Fate Fizz deck is sort of turning me off the Lee Sin a bit. How do you feel about Lee Sin?
Yeah, I agree. Lee Sin is one of those decks that, if you played 1,000 games with it, it's probably still going to be a good tournament choice for you. There's so much play to it. If you understand your matchups really well, you'll win games with it. You can apply pressure to your opponents. If you are going to bring Lee Sin, maybe build the rest of your lineup so you can ban, TF Fizz, which I think is your worst matchup, which is most likely to show up at the tournament.
Yeah, and also, it is a terrible matchup. Targon Kench is also quite bad, which I've heard a lot of people talking about. The Ezreal Teemo deck is a really bad matchup, which has been getting just more and more popular. I've been seeing heaps of it on the ladder. Fiora Shen is really bad now with the Hush nerfs again, just wrecking that. I don't know. Looking at the data, I find it difficult to want to include Targon Lee. When I look at the positive matchups and when I look at the ones that have a bigger sample size, so over 200 games, there's only one deck there, the Ezreal Draven deck, and that's a good deck to have a positive matchup, but everything else is, like Anivia's there for a good matchup, but that's only 70 games, and then there's Anivia in the bad matchup with 400 games, so much more likely that's a bad matchup. I just don't think there's much that Lee Sin is preying on at the moment. I think what sort of happened is Lee Sin forced out a lot of decks out of the meta, and then Aphelios and the TF have risen as mid-range, and all the sort of bigger decks like FTR that Lee Sin forced out of the meta haven't risen up yet. And maybe that's a good call in the season, was to pick up some of those later game decks that Lee Sin forced out and bring those.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a reasonable strategy. Maybe bringing back those decks that are weak to deny when most lineups are likely to only run a single deny deck, if any deny deck at all. So that could be well worth looking into. Yeah,
that's not something I really thought about before. We might talk about more when I've got time to. I don't have anything eloquent to say about it now, so maybe we'll just move on. I don't want to imply that I'm like trying to hide any testing, because this is 100% where I'm at the moment with what I want to play with the seasonal. These are all my thoughts. This is exactly what I'm thinking. There's nothing that I'm hiding or not showing, so I just want to be clear about that. Probably should have done that earlier on, but
yeah, it's all right. It's all right.
We'll be able to draw a direct line of thinking between what we're saying now and what we end up playing, unless I do the audible I did it last second for the last seasonal. Right, let's move on to discard aggro, which is another just omnipresent threat in the meta, and I think a better call than ever before, basically, for this seasonal, because it just goes under. There's a real mid-range focus with Aphelios and TF, and discard aggro just goes under all those mid-range decks and wins before they're able to do their powerful things. It doesn't matter creating 100 cards and getting card advantage with Aphelios, because you're just already dead. And so if we look at some of the positive matchups, there's just a bunch of Aphelios decks here. Those Teemo Ezreal decks that are getting quite popular, a really good matchup. It's good against Freljord Overwhelm. It goes under Pirate aggro as well. God, I'm not going to talk about Deep, but I swear every deck we've looked at has had just an absurd 60-70% matchup against Deep. I just want to just say don't play Deep, please. It seems bad against everything.
It's definitely fallen from its one-time dominance of Constructed.
Yeah, the Ashe deck, discard's really good against. Tom, discard's really good against. Lee Sin, discard's really good against. The Aphelios TF decks, which being good against all the other Aphelios decks is sort of one thing, but this is one of the first decks we've talked about that is actually positive against the Aphelios TF, so that's a really good plus. And then even Fiora Shen 53.6, so I think Fiora Shen's sort of slowly clawing back some points in that matchup, but that is a lot of really good, really meta relevant decks to be positive against. So I think discard aggro is a great place to be.
Yeah, I think discard aggro is pretty strong. I don't think too many people are going to be necessarily targeting discard aggro either. So this is one of those decks that can have a massive target on its head because cards like Withering Wail and some of the other Shadow Isle control package cards can just absolutely destroy this deck, and you could build multiple viable decks that have those packages. But I'm just really not expecting people to do that for this tournament, so something like Discard Aggro does become a lot stronger as a, one aggro deck in the rest of your lineup.
Yeah, there's been a lot of... Because looking at some of the matchups I've been thinking about, I've often been like, oh, it's fine if they don't have like Fiora Shen and Discard Aggro. And I feel like those are two odd decks to have in your lineup. But the more I start to look at things, I start to think, well, just because it's an odd pairing from a sort of, they're very different decks, doesn't mean that it won't make sense in your lineup. And so I've started to sort of note whenever we're talking about decks and I'm like, oh, it'd be bad if you had this odd combination of decks. I'm starting to note that a bit more because maybe that odd combination of decks is what we want to be on.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to deconstruct things and figure out what we should run.
And as far as the bad matchups for Discard Aggro, what we're looking at is Anivia, which we talked about before. It's a miserable matchup, and so I think that's one of the biggest pluses for Anivia. And Go Hard is another really bad matchup and that's another big plus I think for Go Hard. But outside of that, Ezreal Draven is a good matchup as well. It's a bad matchup for Discard Aggro, but that's pretty much it. There's not a lot of ways to target. There's a lot of ways to target Discard Aggro, but as Simon said, like Shadow Isles as a region just isn't at the popularity that it was a few months ago, and so a lot of those decks that would have preyed on Discard Aggro just aren't present at the moment in this meta. Yeah,
definitely. And I think, one of the ways you could end up being in trouble would be if somebody was trying to, target TF Fizz by running those Avalanches, those Withering Wails, those cards that Discard Aggro kind of sucks against as well, and then you get splash hit. But I don't think anybody's going to specifically target Discard Aggro, and I would be surprised if that many players take that path as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that there will be some splash hate, and so it's just something to consider if you're considering Discard Aggro, which we are. Yeah, safe to say. All right, let's move on. I'm pretty sure that the order that I'm sort of going through these decks is roughly in play order at Masters, but I think we sort of got a bit switched around a bit at the start. But but it's still roughly that, I think. So we're going to look at Teemo. I mentioned that because Teemo Ezreal is a deck that I don't think is getting talked about much, and I just see this deck on ladder so often, and not just on my main, but also on my Smurf in Platinum and Diamond. I just see a heap of this deck. And so I think it's definitely one that I've been looking at and considering, because I really want to understand what its matchups are and where it sort of fits in the meta, because decks like this can often be really good calls for the season, or decks that have specific axes that they attack on. So this deck, for example, it's really trying to get down Hexcore Foundry, cause your opponent to overdraw it, cause you to your curve is really low, so you can play out more cards than they can, and just sort of overwhelm them in that way, and then eventually win with Ezreal or just milling them out. And so attacking on that sort of different axes is really powerful. You're not really going to get much splash hate from other things, so I think it's a really interesting deck.
Yeah, it's definitely a list that I haven't run into quite as much, so I might need to do some testing to be more prepared for it. So at this point, I'm not considering it for my lineup because I haven't really played with or against it, but I will play some games with it and see how it goes.
Yeah, and so looking at the data, I mean, this is, it does get less impressive for me. It's really good against Anivia, so if you want to beat Anivia, it's a really good option. Really good against Lee Sin. And then there's a couple of TF decks, TF Aphelios decks that it's positive against, but there's also a couple of TF Aphelios decks in the negative ones, so I feel like that matchup is probably on the cusp. And then there are a lot of very meta-relevant negative matchups. The Pirates matchups is 22%, which is incredibly low. That's unbelievably low.
That's not great.
Both of the Draven decks are really bad matchups. Soraka Tarm's really bad. Fizz TF is really bad. Gohard's really bad. So I think there's just too many negatives for this deck, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have seen some people talk about running it as their third deck in a lineup, but Yeah, there are so many other choices that we'll have to see how much it shows up.
Yeah, yeah. So let's move on to one of the other one. And so this is one that is again it's a important note about the data that this one's showing up a bit low in terms of popularity, but that's just because that for Twisted Fate Aphelios, I cannot state enough how many different builds there are for this deck. It is absolutely absurd, and that really plays with the data. Like because it's not even just your flex slots. There's whole flex regions. Both Bilgewater, Targon, and Bilgewater, Piltover, and Zorn are really popular, and so there's a lot of caveats around talking about this deck because the data gets so spread out and split, and also it's affected so much by the different cards that you include.
Yes. So sorry, did you say TF Fizz? Oh, sorry, TF Aphelios?
Yeah.
All right, but then you were saying PNZ as well. What's the go with that?
Yeah, that... Oh, you can't be pins. Well, I think... No. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I'm not sure why that's there. That's
some technical difficulties in mobalytics.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note that this data's... Yeah, there's some funny things, but... Anyway, all the points still stand, except for that one. So if we delve into the data, the biggest tick that this deck has for me is that it's good against TF Fizz, and there's just basically no other deck that beats that deck, and so that is just a gigantic tick. Outside of that, really positive against Anivia as well. You can see why it's not sounding really good for Anivia, because there's a lot of decks that are preying on it. Really good against Twisted Fate Go Hard, which a lot of people have been trying and has been quite popular. Really good against Lee Sin, which again, I'm not looking to include. Pretty good against Fiora Shen, which is another massive tick because that deck is very hard to have a good matchup against. And so, I mean, that's just a really good set of positive lineups to have. And so I think this is one of the strongest decks that you can include. And the only real problem with it is that you can't also run TF Fizz.
Yeah, can't run TF Fizz, can't run another Aphelios list. Which, honestly, if you weren't planning on running one of those decks, then this is probably a really strong option. I think the fact that it just kind of beats the other TF decks is just a really, really strong sell. And I think that's something important that I would be looking for in my TF deck. Personally, the way that I'm sort of building my lineup at the moment, so I've got a pretty good idea that I think my first two decks are going to be TF Fizz and Fiora Shannon. So I'm thinking based off that I most likely want to be banning TF Aphelios. So I'm keeping that in mind when looking for the third deck to round out my lineup.
Yeah, but I think that is a really good way of sort of explaining the step-by-step nature that I think you want to have to building a lineup. I don't think you want to just put three decks together and then figure out. I think you want to really go through that iterative process of, okay, I really like Fiora Shen, looking at that deck's strengths and weaknesses, and then, okay, TF Fizz is another really strong deck, looking at the overlap, and then what third deck goes with those. I think that's really sort of how you want to go through building a good lineup.
Yeah, and yeah, the TF Aphelios list, I think one of the best things about it is just Aphelios with Bilgewater is just so strong. Like, Aphelios is such a good card by itself, but when you're, pulling a 3-4 Boxtopus out of your deck on turn 3, that actually feels broken, and that can just beat so many decks which could be bad matchups or might have gotten off to a really, really strong start themselves.
Yeah, that interaction is so powerful that Steve Rubin directly addressed it on Twitter to say, look, this is something we're aware of, and we didn't want to pre-nerf it, because we wanted to let players play with it for a bit. It's sort of a feel. Some players complain about, if they'd said that, they would have come up with a more elegant solution, but that, so they say Boxtopus on summon, deal 3 damage to it instead of play. If they had have made that change, it's very clear that they're doing it because of this interaction, and so people would be crabby that, they don't get to do that. So this way, people get to do it for a bit, but Steve Rubin's essentially implying that they're definitely going to keep a close eye on it, and they think that it might end up getting nerfed because it's just that powerful.
Yeah, it is just so strong. And I think just as a bit of an aside from the TF Aphelios lists, some of the other decks that have been popping up, so there's a Bilgewater Targon list which plays Diana instead of Twisted Fate. So that you get to sort of hold that same really strong interaction, especially given that the TF Aphelios list, some builds aren't running pick a card. They've sort of moved away from that now. So it is really difficult to flip your Twisted Fate. TF's obviously still a great card and a must-answer threat, but the Diana Aphelios decks have been looking pretty strong and could be a reasonable alternative in a tournament lineup.
Yeah, it's not going to be one we talk about today because there's not enough data on it. We're talking about it now. But I really like the games I've played with it as well. And one of the strengths is that a lot of the other lists aren't running any 2-drops so that you consistently hit Boxtopus, which I really like. I think that running Mount and Goat just... the delta between hitting Mount and Goat and hitting Boxtopus is so much that I really want to be hitting Boxtopus because it's totally busted. And so having Diana lets you have a 2-drop, like you said, that doesn't get in the way of Boxtopus. So you're able to still curve out if you need that. It's also just a really strong threat at the moment with how the meta's gone a bit more mid-range. It lets you kill Twisted Fate, which is really important. And so... And yeah, it lets you run a different Twisted Fate deck. So it has a lot of the strengths, I think, of the Twisted Fate Aphelios deck, but you can put it in the lineup with Twisted Fate Fizz. So that's just a really big plus for that Aphelios Diana list.
Definitely.
And so something else that's sort of worth noting is that, yeah, again, I think we've said this before, but you can't have Twisted Fate Aphelios and Twisted Fate Fizz in your lineup. And so what that means is that it's sort of okay. If your plan is to ban Twisted Fate Aphelios and all three of your decks are weak to Twisted Fate Fizz, then that's fine because you're never going to be in a position where your opponent has both of those decks. And so... that's a really good shared weakness to have because even though they're two really popular decks and there'll be a lot of both of them, they can't have both. And so it's really important to try and take that into account when you're passing all of this information.
For sure. There are so many different variables that you can take into account. And if you just do that, if you just make some of those decisions or think it through, you'll just find ways to improve your lineup or get an edge pretty easily.
Yeah, and so if you do want to target Twisted Fate Aphelios, some of the lists that you can be looking at to do that are Targon Kench. So Soraka Kench has been showing up a lot on the positive matchups and the negative matchup side. It's got really polarizing matchups, and this is one of the really good ones. Pirate Aggro is really good here as well. Teemo with Ezreal is pretty good. Freljord Aggro, and then Discard Aggro as well just goes under the list.
Yeah.
I've been throwing to you at a couple of weird times where there's not really anything for you to add, and just want to apologize for that.
That's right. I was going to bring it up later in private, but I'm glad that you addressed it now.
Yeah, I mean, I just need to take breaks sometimes.
That's totally fair. Yeah, you're the only one with mobalytics, so you really... I appreciate all the work you're putting into this episode. Yeah.
So another one that we've been talking about a bit and has been coming up because I think it's quite well positioned is Pirate Aggro. And so for the last week, Pirate Aggro and Freljord Overwhelm were two decks that I was really interested in because I think their matchup spreads are fantastic. And if we look at the positive matchups for Pirate Aggro, Anivia is there in the positives, Twisted Fate Aphelios, which is again a difficult deck to have a good matchup against, Twisted Fate Fizz, which is another really difficult deck to have a positive matchup against. And so yeah, some of those, because the pillars in the metagame for me are like Twisted Fate Fizz, Anivia, Twisted Fate Aphelios, and Fiora Shen. And Fiora Shen is a negative matchup for Pirate Aggro, but you can ban that one. So having positives against all of those decks is something that I think is really good, and I think Pirate Aggro is very well positioned.
Yeah, I think it's in a much better spot than it has been. It basically sort of fell off the radar when it got hit with some nerfs quite a while back now, maybe 3-ish months ago when Petty Deckhand was nerfed from a 3-2 into a 3-1. I think there were a couple of other small nerfs and new champions released, and it sort of fell off the radar when it used to be a huge meta player, the best deck for a little while. Yeah,
and I think it is sort of prepped to come back again. It just sort of is a bit faster, a bit more aggressive, able to go under the mid-range focus, value focus, TF Aphelios based decks that are so present at the moment. So yeah, really good time. And it's also, and somehow, and I don't really understand how, it's able to beat Anivia, allegedly, which I haven't really tested. You were testing it. You were saying that, it's good against Anivia.
Yep. So played some games. So went 2-1 with Pirates against the Anivia deck. The games felt pretty close, but I would have assumed beforehand that Anivia was a favourite, just given all of its life gain, its ability to sort of clear the board. But the matchups did feel sort of very close, maybe slightly favoured towards Pirates.
Yeah, another reason why Pirates definitely dropped off is that Go Hard is still a really bad matchup, and so it would have been worse previously.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely, Pirates are definitely one that, and like I said before, I've been including a bunch of my lineups when we've been scrimming, and it just keeps getting banned. So it's a really strong deck, and I think it's an interesting one that you can work into lineups. Unfortunately, it does. Oh no, I was going to say something, but that wasn't true, so I'm not going to say it. I find it really hard to tell with these decks if they have the same color combinations as other decks. So I have to keep checking.
Yeah, that's a good move. And especially now that Scouts has completely fallen out of the meta, you're not really giving up anything by, running a Misfortune deck either.
Yeah, because I just feel like TF Fizz should be overlapping with other popular decks with the colors.
It just doesn't.
Yeah, it's just no one else is running those colors, but I keep checking.
You're doing good work.
So the sort of counterpart to discard aggro is they call it slow burn or mobalytics, but what's the actual name of that? The Draven Ezreal. Do we just call it Draven Ezreal?
Yeah, Draven Ezreal.
Yeah, the deck names on mobalytics are just a bit odd. The Draven Ezreal is sort of a counterpart to discard aggro, and sometimes it's been the most popular deck, and it's been quite consistently very popular, very good for a long period of time now. So I'd be expecting, it's a deck that a lot of people are really comfortable with. Not us. We've never done well with the deck. We don't really understand what we're doing wrong. But I would expect to see a lot of this at the seasonal as well. It's really good against Targon Kench, which is important because I think a lot of people are starting to consider that. It's really good against Pirate aggro, which is really good. Good against discard aggro as well. Even against Fiora Shannon, maybe a bit positive. I think it's positive. Yeah, that used to be a really bad matchup. I think Fiora Shannon's edged it back a bit now. Maybe with the Captain Farron nerfs have helped there. And some of the... What do you think of those as far as like a positive matchup spread goes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty solid matchup spread. I could imagine a lineup where you really want to target something like discard aggro, those sorts of decks, and you run Go Hard, Draven Ezreal, and Anivia as your three ways to sort of do that while still having pretty strong decks on their own. But yeah, personally, I don't think I'm going to be slotting Draven Ezreal into my lineup.
Yeah, like as far as the big players we talked about before, I'm just not seeing many of those in the positive matchup spread. Like the TF Aphelios decks are pretty 50-50. Twisted Fate Fizz is negative. Go Hard's negative. Anivia's really negative. Lee Sin's negative. And so, whilst you've got some good matchup, I just don't feel that... I'm not close to considering Draven Ezreal, really. Plus, there's the fact that Draven's got some other really good shells that I think are just much better calls at the moment.
Yeah, same as Ezreal, honestly. There are a couple of different places where you can run it.
Yeah. Let's move on to just one of the decks. It's always one of the most interesting decks in the meta, Soraka, and one that we've heard a lot of people talking about. A lot of streamers are apparently considering this for their lineup, and I mean that makes sense because it's got a lot of really good, a lot of really bad matchups, and so I think it's a really interesting one to include, and I think that it could definitely be a great meta call because of those polarizing matchups. So some of the good matchups, we've talked a lot about this deck before, but Anivia is really good, Go Hard's really good, TF Aphelios is really good, Lee Sin's really good. Unfortunately, getting to the negatives, TF Fizz is really bad, Draven Ezreal's really bad, discard aggro is really bad, and so if you're able to, again, you can't have two Draven decks, and so the fact that two Draven decks are some of your worst matchups isn't necessarily a bad thing if you can craft your lineup around that. The issues would be things like someone having Twisted Fate Fizz and then a Draven deck, and that's where you start to end up in trouble.
Yeah, definitely. Soraka Kench does feel like the kind of deck that if you're adding it to your lineup, it's because it's a meta call, and it's likely that you are going to need to build your other decks around Soraka Kench or make some concessions there to make it work. So it's not a deck that you can just sort of throw into any lineup like a lot of the other decks we've mentioned. You don't end up in a disastrous situation with a lot of them, but Soraka Kench definitely feels like a high risk, high reward option.
Yeah, I think some decks are good ones that there's some decks that you could just add into a lineup, like you said, and there's some decks that you really need to start building around. And Timerarker's one where that's the first deck in your lineup, and you start asking those questions about the weaknesses and strength, all centered around that deck. That's really, I don't think it's often going to be correct that you have two decks and you're looking for a third one, and Timerarker just happens to be the perfect fit. I think you need to really center your strategy and approach around this deck.
Yeah, definitely. It is good to note as well that Tahm Kench lines up really well against Aphelios, just on a card-to-card basis. It's really easy to eat the Aphelios. Those decks tend to not really have that many ways to deal with Kench. So I think that's a really, strong thing to keep in mind. If you're expecting a lot of Aphelios, that would be a reason to run the list, but you definitely need, I think, more than that, and you really have to have a plan.
Yeah, I think it's a similar thing where killing Twisted Fate is really important and pretty hard for a lot of decks to do at the moment. And Tahm Kench is a similar thing where you've got to kill it or else it just takes over the game. And so that's a really positive for it as well. Also, SI lists have historically, I think, run a lot of remove, which can kill Tahm Kench, and there's just not much of that kicking around. So there's definitely a lot of pluses for the deck at the moment in this specific meta.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, even having the Shadow Isles package sometimes isn't enough. I mean, you just said Soraka Tahm is a favourite against Anivia. That's got all those Shadow Isle control cards, and it's still, I think, really hard for that deck to beat Starspring, and Tahm Kench can just eat Anivias and be protected long enough to flip.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. It's which is... If SI isn't how you target that deck, then how do you? And I mean, we went over the other decks, but it's definitely an interesting one. So the new version of Go Hard, for those that like paying 5 mana for Pack Your Bags, it's a deck that totally fell off, and then it's been picking up a bit steadily, and it's sort of reached a reasonable level of popularity. It's certainly something that we've heard people considering. It's not really one that I've been super close to considering. I haven't really liked the look particularly of the lists that have been going. I think the list would have to change a bit more significantly from what the glory days of Go Hard for me to feel like it's a powerful deck in its own right, and not just people hanging on to it because of what was once going on. I don't think that if Go Hard was initially printed like it is, that this deck would be at this level of popularity, if that makes sense. I don't think that the inherent stuff that it's doing is as powerful as some of the other decks. I don't know if I've made my point quite clearly there, but...
No, I get what you're saying. People are still sort of thinking back to how broken Go Hard used to be, and that's sort of influencing them now. They're remembering all the times that they played Ledros into Pack Your Bags and won on the spot.
Yeah, I think it's inflated, the play rate of the deck. But if we're going to look at the matchup spread, so it's really good against Discard Aggro, which is, again, a deck that we think is quite strong at the moment. Really good against the other Draven deck, the Draven Ezreal. Really good against Pirate Aggro. Really good against Lee Sin. And good against Twisted Fate Fizz. So, I mean, that's at least worth considering the deck, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would honestly be... It's interesting. I think TF Fizz is the main reason why you might want to play this deck, and it's also maybe the main reason why you won't play this deck. So, you've got a positive matchup, but then you can't play TF Fizz, so you've got to make that choice, and I think a lot of people are going to, pick TF Fizz as one of their decks. I think I'm going to make that choice, so...
Well, the other thing is that you could just pick... If you wanted to beat TF Fizz, and you had a TF slot, you could play Twisted Fate Aphelios, and so... Which has got much better matchup spread, I think, than Go Hard. And so,
definitely. Yeah, unless you're targeting Discard Aggro, then, I think you're much more likely to play that Aphelios TF list.
Let me just quickly, I just want to... because Twisted Fate Aphelios is weak into Discard Aggro, so that's that's a big polarizing one. But then your bad matchups, and there are some popular decks here. You're bad into Tarm, you're bad into Twisted Fate Aphelios, you're bad into Anivia, and you're bad into our big boy Shen. Love to see it.
Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah, you love to see it. Yeah.
All right, so Freljord Overwhelm is... Yeah, like I said, I think, oh God, when I get up these stats, they just look so good. When I was doing a lot of data trawling this week, this was the first deck that I was like, oh my God, I'm 100% playing this, because the matchups, when you look at them, it's positive into Anivia, it's positive into Twisted Fate Fizz, it's positive into Pirate Aggro, it's positive into Teemo Ezreal, it's positive into Fiora Shannon, it's positive into Twisted Fate Aphelios, and it's positive into Draven Ezreal. That is a gigantic portion of the meta.
Yeah. And you have experience with the deck as well. You played it in the last season, is that right?
Yeah, I did play it in the last seasonal, and it was definitely my least favorite deck in the last seasonal. I just grabbed a list from Mobalytics, and I didn't like the list at all. And a couple of games in, I was like, yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of changes I made to this list. Although I do think that I think that Decisive Maneuver is a lot better now than it was then. I think that it's a lot harder to counter that spell. There's less deny. There's less impactful ways to... It always felt like Decisive Maneuver when I cast it last seasonal was... I'm going to lose, and so I need to just go all in here, and if they have anything, I die. And it happened a lot. Whereas now I feel like Decisive Maneuver is my like, haha, I'm killing you, there's nothing you can do. So... I think the list is even better positioned than it was in that tournament, and it was pretty good there. So, yeah, it's a really good list. The problem that I've had that I alluded to or mentioned before is that we tested a TF Fizz matchup last night, and it's meant to be really good, and it just felt awful. Your turn, Twisted Fate Fizz is sort of a turn 5-6 deck, and I felt like a turn 6-7 deck. And so they were just... I just couldn't kill TF, and they were always able to flip it. And so, yeah, that was really bad. And like I said, maybe it's just about running a couple more answers to it, some more Death Send, some more Culling Strike. Maybe that swings it. But again, that's a change that I'm making now to try and adjust this matchup. And the data's saying that it should already be a good matchup. And so I haven't been able to really get to the bottom of why I'm seeing that disconnect between the data and how my personal experiences.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. And I think given that the tournament is, 3 days away as well, if we're playing the matchup and they're not quite working and you've got to tune, then I think that's just a much better indicator than the data.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I'm basically off this deck now. I do think that it's a great deck. I think it's got a lot of really good matchups. If you've got a lot of reps, I think it's really rewarding. But that particular matchup has just it's just turned me off it. And so, yeah. And the only negative matchups it has are Discard Aggro and Lee Sin. And so, amazing spread.
Yeah. You know what? I could still see you playing it. We'll come back to this next week.
Yeah, we'll see where we all end up. So the last deck that we have up to talk about, and again, one that's sort of been cropping up a bit, is mid-range Frostbite, the Ashe deck, the Ashe Sejuani deck. And so this is one that I would not recommend including this deck, for similar reasons to some of the other decks we talked about, that I just don't think it has a great matchup spread. Your positive matchups, like it destroys Fiora Shen. If that's all you want to do in the seasonal, and there's not many decks you can include to do that, then yeah, you want to be on the Ashe train. But and maybe, I mean, if you're expecting a super high amount of Fiora Shen, then that's pretty good. I mean, it'll get banned a lot. I'll ban it every round I see it if I'm on Fiora Shen. But I mean, that's still powerful, and so that's always going to be a great matchup. Twisted Fate Aphelios is a really good matchup. Lee Sin is just getting pummeled by a lot of decks.
Yeah.
Draven Ezreal is a good matchup, but then in the negative spot you have Anivia, you've got TF Fizz, you've got Draven, Discard Aggro, and you've got Pirate Aggro.
Yeah, it's just a lot of decks, and it's a lot of decks that people, I could see people having Anivia and TF Fizz,
yeah,
in their lineup. So it's really hard to just say, okay, I'll just ban the bad matchup if you have a lot of bad matchups that people could realistically play.
I mean, TF Fizz, Discard Aggro, and Pirate Aggro are 3 decks that you could run, and you could have those in your lineup. That could be your lineup.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a pretty reasonable lineup. So, yeah, I don't think it's a great time to be on the Ashe. I think there's some decks that sort of have similar polarizing matchups, but I think there's other ones that are good meta calls, and Ashe, I just feel like, is one. It's a non-starter for me.
Yeah, definitely. I had high hopes that Ashe Sedge would come back and be a meta player after some of the recent, patch changes, but it just hasn't really happened.
Yeah, I played it. I went on a pretty good win streak on my ult with it, which was nice. It's a nice one for the ults as well because you get a bunch of Ashes as part of it. Yeah, for free. So that's really sweet. And it got some cool tools. There were a lot of Ashe Riven sort of variants that were running around, and you can do some cool stuff with the Quick Strike Riven spell and the 5/1 Challenger. You can do some cool stuff there. There's some cool interactions. But yeah, I mean the meta's settled down, and I mean the mid-range decks are just ranching it.
Yeah, it's definitely missed its time, or who knows? It could come back, but I feel like not enough is going to change in the next 3 days that it's going to be a huge player in the tournament this weekend.
Yeah, so that's sort of. Are there any decks that we haven't talked about that you are considering running in your lineup?
I think Field Rush is the only deck that I would maybe be considering. I think it's got a pretty good, TF Fizz win rate. I think it beats up on a lot of these mid-range decks. It seems reasonable against the Aphelios lists. The sort of issue with it is, deny. So I guess Fiora Shen is the main deny deck that you're going to be seeing. Apparently, it's slightly unfavored against Anivia as well, which I don't think has historically been the case, but some changes to the deck have made that happen. So I'm not sure if it's a great deck to be running in your lineup right now. For instance, I've been thinking about it because I'm going to be running most likely Fiora Shen and TF Fizz, but then if I run Field Rush in that slot as well, suddenly I might be really incentivized to ban my opponent's copy of Fiora Shen, whereas previously I would have had 2 50-50 matchups against it. So yeah. I don't really want to ruin my ban phase by running Field Rush. But I think if you had a different lineup, it could be, a dark horse player that is quite good this weekend.
Yeah, totally agree. And sort of like we alluded to before, Lee Sin really pushed FTR out of the meta, but it was huge before then. And now that Lee Sin's dropped down, it's perfect time to come back in with those decks that it was preying on and just stomp over the meta. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see FTR doing incredibly well next week and the week after. Another deck that I was considering a bit, but ultimately have gone off is there's sort of 2 Freljord Overwhelm versions. There's a lower to the ground version with Darius, Draven, Sejuani, some combination of those, and then there's more of a mono Freljord version which utilizes, I want to say, Avalanche Riders. I should have just got it up. I've got it right here. And is more looking at Sejuani and Tryndamere, and sometimes this is the more sort of classic Rico Rex version that, in my opinion, Avarosan Outriders is the 4-mana Allegiance card, and one of your really powerful interactions is playing Avarosan Trapper on turn 3, and then if you don't draw the Yeti on turn 4, then you play Avarosan Outriders, and then you've got a high chance of the next turn having a 1-mana 8/8 Trampling Yeti, which is really powerful. I really like that deck. I played that in the last seasonal, and it was the strongest deck. I don't think I lost with it all day. It felt really good. I played it a lot afterwards. I think it's an amazing call. The only problem with it at the moment is that this deck doesn't kill Twisted Fate, and it's got a similar turn kill to the other Overwhelm deck, and so I just found that I wasn't killing it, and TF was then just making it so I couldn't win.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. Especially, I think TF is probably going to be the most played champion.
Yeah, I think that's pretty safe to say at this stage.
Yeah. So one other thing that I wanted to have a chat about today as well is the Last Chance Gauntlet is coming up. So obviously we've talked about the Gauntlet in the past and how its rules are a bit different to a regular tournament. So I think a really good lineup for the Last Chance Gauntlet, which I might not end up playing in the actual tournament, is Fiora Shannon, Feel the Rush, and TF Fizz. You get a really good matchup spread, and your pick ban phase gets a little bit polarized because of Feel the Rush. You can force your opponent into making the wrong ban, and if you do end up in a spot where, let's say they have 3 deny decks, you just end up playing your non-FTR deck no matter what they ban. So I think that's a really, really strong lineup that you could jam, and honestly, I think the games would be reasonably fast with that lineup as well. So if that's something that you're keeping in mind, that you have to be one of the first 320-ish people to get a Prime Glory to qualify, I think that could be a pretty strong lineup for you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call. Question I have that you might not have the answer to. We talked before about there'll always be there'll always only be 320 people from the Gauntlets, right? And the 700 will just cascade down the Masters tier list until there's enough people in. There won't be ever more than 320 people from the Gauntlet, I believe.
Yeah, so I think the way it works is there are 2 separate queues. So there's a queue for Masters players who have missed out on the tournament, and a queue for Last Chance Gauntlet players who've qualified but weren't one of the first 320 to do so. And then it just goes through those queues. So definitely, if you really want to get in on the Last Chance Gauntlet, try to do it as early as you can. That's another reason why having some Prime Glories can be really advantageous. But good luck.
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty exciting meta at the moment. I'm really enjoying it. I do think that, there's a few decks that TF Fizz is probably a bit oppressive. TF Aphelios might be a bit oppressive as well. There might need to be some slight changes there, but that also, whilst that is true of ladder and can affect the ladder experience, in the tournament setting, that's not necessarily... it doesn't really matter, right? Because you can just ban out the TF decks, because you can't run more than one TF deck, so those things sort of iron out in the wash. And I've been really enjoying preparing for this format, for looking at lineups. I'll be interested to see where we end up. Like Simon was saying, I think at the moment I'm feeling similar to you. I really like Fiora Shen. I really like TF Fizz, and then maybe the Aphelios Diana deck. That might be where I end up on Monday.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable option. I think, I just need to test out a few different lists, have a few different options, and the third deck is always the most challenging one, right?
Yeah, it always is. It always is. I'm sure we'll get there though, and it'll be fun. I really enjoyed playing the season last time. It blew my mind how seamless and well integrated it was in the client, and there just wasn't a hiccup. So I'm looking forward to doing it again. There'll be some cosmetic rewards as well this time, which is a bit of fun. Yeah, no, it should be really good. I'm really looking forward to playing. Yeah, so thanks everyone for listening to this ep. We will keep the discussion going in our Discord channel. There's been a bunch of people joining and a lot of discussion going on there, and so over the next 3 or 4 days until the season, we'll keep posting in there new thoughts that we have, new lists that we're liking, if anything dramatic changes, if Simon falls off the deep end and ends up registering deep, we'll be posting about that. And we'll also be looking for, if anyone wants to test lineups, then that's a good place you can find us, and if we're free, we're always down to jam some games. So we'll be active in there and looking forward to the seasonal. Yeah, I hope to see you there. Also follow us on Twitter, and there'll be all that information in the show notes. We've got a YouTube channel now. There's no videos up there yet, but this ep should be hopefully the first ep to go up, because we've set it all up, and now hopefully it works. So we'll see. Maybe you're listening to this on YouTube now, but we're not really sure how it works. I'm surprised that people listen to podcasts on YouTube, but apparently it's a thing that people do, and so we've tried to set it up. We'll see how it goes. Yeah. All right. Thanks everyone for listening, and good luck in the seasonal to all that are competing.